I am an operations coordinator at a cemetery, or simply a cemetery manager, whichever you prefer. My job involves organizing funerals and assisting with the sale of burial plots, always dealing directly with grieving families. Once, a man named Antonio, around 30 years old and very spiritual, came to me to acquire a burial plot for his father, who was in palliative care. Antonio, with his strong Hispanic accent, radiated warmth. He showed me pictures of his father, a man who seemed too young to be in such a delicate situation. Unfortunately, that same week, Antonio's father passed away, and he arranged the funeral at the cemetery. The day was stormy, something many see as a sign of good luck. The procession made a brief stop in front of the main building, and I stepped outside to see Antonio in the car right behind the hearse. We waved to each other. Then, I went back inside the building until the procession was ready to proceed to the burial site. In one of the cemetery's trucks, I followed the procession to the final resting place. There, I stood supervising with my umbrella, making sure everything went according to plan. After the funeral, I did a round through the cemetery as usual and returned to my office to take care of paperwork and prepare to close the site. Since the cemetery closes at 5:30 p.m., I made one last round to ensure all visitors had left before locking the gates. Even though it was early March and a relatively warm day, because of the storm, it already felt like night. As I was heading back to the office, I saw something strange. It looked like someone was walking quickly between the gravestones but soon disappeared behind a hedge. I honked to alert them that the cemetery was closing, but the person vanished. I grabbed my umbrella and went to the area, but after searching for 20 minutes, I found no one. Back at the office, I checked the security cameras. Despite the rain making visibility difficult, there was no sign of any unusual movement. While trying to finish up the paperwork, I heard the door to the visitation room slam. My first thought was that the person was still in the cemetery, so I quickly went out to the lobby, but I didn't find anyone. Once again, I looked around, and at one point, when I glanced out the window, I saw someone outside staring at me. I was immediately startled, and for a brief moment I recognized that face. It was Antonio's father, the man I had seen in the photos. I ran outside, but when I got there, he was gone, as if he had never been there. Completely soaked, I went back to the office, locked everything up, and went home. When I got home, my wife noticed my silence, but I simply said I had a long day at work. To this day, I wonder if I was just exhausted, with my mind playing tricks on me, but the experience still gives me chills when I think about it. My name is Miguel, and this story took place on a cold and windy October night. I live in a relatively large city, but it's quite old and poor, with buildings dating back to the early 18th century. A friend and I were bored and decided to go for a drive at 3 in the morning. I know it's not the most sensible time to be out in a city like this, but we enjoyed a bit of adventure. After driving around for a while, listening to our music, we were both big metal fans and even had a band at the time. We started getting bored and thought it would be interesting to take a walk through the city's cemetery, which is just behind the old central square. This cemetery is huge, about 20 acres on each side of a highway. We decided to explore the older part, which is separated from the newer section by a very old iron fence and gate. As we walked, we tried to read the old moss-covered tombstones and even took a few photos. I know we were being a bit disrespectful, but these were graves over a century old, so I figured no one alive would care, and I doubted that those buried there would either. After about an hour, we stopped to rest near a pecan tree in the middle of the old cemetery. That's when we heard the laugh of a child, very close to where we were. My first thought was that it was some motion-activated toy left at a child's grave or something like that. I don't scare easily, so it didn't really bother me. We both laughed, commenting on how it was a little creepy, but we kept talking, enjoying the atmosphere. However, at some point, I got that familiar feeling of being watched. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, influenced by the spooky environment. Then my friend said, "I think I saw something or someone in the shadows near those trees." At that moment, we both started getting genuinely scared. We decided to stand up and leave, But then we heard that same laughter again, followed by the sound of footsteps crunching on dry leaves. That's when we ran, without a second thought. We sprinted down the hill to where my car was parked, and I've never run so fast in my life. It felt like the laughter was following us, and we went into full escape mode. The sound stopped when we reached the car. I started the engine and drove off as fast as I could, pulling onto the highway without even checking for traffic. Luckily, there was no accident. We drove to a gas station that's open at night to check the car. We were afraid someone might have done something to it. We went straight to check the back of the car, and to our surprise, the doors were open. I'm absolutely sure neither of us had opened them, and there was no reason for them to be. I checked the back seat to make sure there was nothing, or no one, inside, and we got out of there as quickly as possible. To this day, I don't know what really happened that night. I wonder if we overreacted or if there was something more going on. But the truth is, every time I tell this story, that strange feeling of being watched comes back. When I was 19, my friend Lucas, who always enjoyed playing pranks, showed up in our basement, as he often did during the summer. He had a bottle of Coke in hand, while I was eating my Wendy's meal, when he suggested we go to a small, creepy cemetery on the other side of town. It was a completely random suggestion, and I even mentioned that to him. Still, we had nothing planned for the next day, and I knew exactly which cemetery he was talking about. Although calling it a cemetery was a bit of a stretch, it was more like a plot of land with about 100 gravestones at most. The headstones looked extremely old, and we hadn't seen any signs of recent visits, not in the last 10 years. The place had probably been around for centuries, and it had a gloomy atmosphere, with its Gothic metal fence surrounded by woods on two sides, a road on another, and an old abandoned building on the last. The environment was eerie. After some persistence, Lucas managed to convince me to go. Interestingly, the sky was heavy and reddish, which added even more to the creepy mood. Lucas parked his Honda by the roadside, and I suggested he drive a little farther to avoid drawing attention, as that road had little traffic and might look suspicious. He drove a few more meters, and we stopped, cutting through the woods so we wouldn't be seen entering the cemetery. The fence wasn't very tall, maybe about 5 feet, and it was easy to climb over. Lucas led the way since it was more his idea than mine. We began walking through the small, gloomy cemetery, looking at the old headstones, most from the 19th century, with some inscriptions so worn down they were already illegible. As silly as it sounds, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I started glancing around the woods and commented to Lucas, "This is making me nervous." "I know," he replied. Still feeling watched, I glanced over at the abandoned building, and for a moment I thought I saw someone standing in one of the windows. Even with the dirty glass, it looked like a figure crouched down or moved away from the window. I told Lucas that someone was watching us from that building. He turned to look and decided to search for an entrance. I tried to convince him not to go, suggesting we should leave before something bad happened. I stayed where I was, near the gravestone he had been looking at, while he circled the building until he found an entrance. He called out to me, but I remained where I was. Suddenly I heard a loud noise, like a crack. I looked in that direction and saw an older man, maybe around 55 years old, with grey hair, wearing a black raincoat and jeans. He also had a mustache, but that was all I could make out. Then he opened his mouth, and instead of simply shouting, he roared, "Get out!" His voice was so loud it seemed to scare off the birds around us. Immediately after, I started feeling dizzy, and everything went black. The next thing I remember was waking up while being dragged through the woods. At first, I thought I was being kidnapped, but when I turned, I saw it was just Lucas, who seemed to be in a panic. He told me, "Come on, run to the car." I didn't question him, we just ran through the woods. I could hear footsteps behind me, and when I looked back, I realized we were being followed. I ran even faster. When we reached Lucas's car, he started the engine and we sped off before the car had even fully started. Inside, he told me what had happened. While he was in the building, he found a Baphomet sigil painted on the floor, the satanic symbol. Around it were several creepy dolls with buttons for eyes. I didn't have time to see anything else. He continued, because I heard the old man shouting at you outside. Lucas came running, found me passed out on the ground, and saw the man coming toward me. He started dragging me away, threw me over the fence, and I quickly came to. That's when we ran. I've only fainted once in my life, and it was at that moment. To this day, I don't know why I fainted, but passing out in a cemetery next to a building with satanic rituals definitely makes it even stranger. My grandfather passed away a few years ago, and we were always very close. Last July, on his birthday, I went to visit him at the cemetery. The place where he and my grandmother chose to be buried is about an hour's drive from my apartment. My family lives closer, so they all went together. I, however, needed to go alone. It was a rainy and grey day, and there's nothing more desolate than visiting a cemetery on a day like that. At the entrance, the caretaker asked for the plot number. I provided the information and he allowed me to enter. The cemetery is quite large, and since I had only been there a few times and never driving, I ended up having difficulty finding the exact location. I hardly saw anyone there that day, perhaps because of the overcast weather. Eventually, I found my grandfather's tombstone and parked the car on the grass beside it. I placed flowers on the grave, closed my eyes, and said a prayer. When I finished, I opened my eyes and looked ahead. There was an old man standing about 5 rows away watching me. That man was my grandfather. But that didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. I rubbed my eyes, and he disappeared. I was confused. Was that a spiritual experience, or was my mind playing tricks on me? The feeling of chills washed over me, and to be honest, I was scared. I went back to the car and whispered, "I love you, Grandpa," and I drove away. On the way back home, I started to feel an unexplained headache. I was the only car on Prospect Road, a quiet road lined with trees. It was common to see deer crossing there. As I was driving, I saw someone by the side of the road. This was strange because there were no sidewalks in that area. I slowed down, and that's when I realized it was my grandfather again. My heart raced, and in panic I accidentally swerved the car. I desperately tried to regain control and stop the vehicle. Fortunately, the car didn't hit any trees, it just slid to a stop in the middle of the road. When I looked back to where I had seen my grandfather, there was only a deer staring at the car. My heart was pounding. I was shaken and just wanted to get home as quickly as possible. I checked for oncoming cars and returned to my lane. The rest of the drive was tough. My mind was racing, and I felt strange, as if something was out of place. It wasn't a sick feeling, but something wasn't right. That night, after watching an episode of my favorite show, I went to bed early. Around 2 in the morning, I was awakened by the ringing of my cell phone. It was an unknown number. My heart raced again. A call at this hour is never a good sign. I answered, put the phone to my ear, and only heard static. Finally, I asked, "Hello?" More static. But what I heard next, I couldn't believe. For a brief moment, for less than a second, I'm sure I heard my grandfather's voice. I tried to ask, "Hello?" again, but I was so shaken that I could barely speak. My whole body was trembling. And then the call dropped. The next day, I contacted the carrier to try to trace the number, but they said they didn't have enough information to do so. The events of that day were undoubtedly the scariest I have ever experienced. Was my grandfather trying to communicate with me in some way? I don't know, it sounds absurd. You'd think that going through something like this would bring joy and excitement, but instead, it still haunts me. To this day, I don't know what to think or feel about it. Every night I wonder, was it really my grandfather on the other end of the line? My friends and I did a lot of silly things in our teenage years. We were about 17 or 18 years old when this story happened. It was October, and with Halloween approaching, I wanted to do something spooky. There was a small cemetery about 10 minutes from my house, and on a drunken night with friends, I suggested that we should sneak into it. I'll make up some names for them. Ryan and Mike. We were at Ryan's house, who never drank, so he ended up driving us to the cemetery. Mike and I were more excited about the idea, while Ryan just tagged along since he was sober. He parked in a deserted spot across the street. It was past midnight and there was no one around. We checked to see if the way was clear and jumped over the cemetery fence. It wasn't completely dark, but visibility was limited, so we used the flashlights on our iPhones. It seemed there was no security around, so we spread out a bit. Ryan stayed closer to Mike while I walked a little further away, always with my flashlight on. I could still see the two of them in the distance because of the glow from their phones. I decided it would be a good idea to start recording a video to make the moment scarier. So I began filming some old gravestones and the overall atmosphere of the place. After a while, I noticed I couldn't see Mike and Ryan nearby anymore, so I went after them, still filming. I looked at my phone screen and froze. There was a woman, in a white dress or robe, with long grey hair, looking down at the ground. I lifted my head to look directly, but she wasn't there. When I looked back at the screen, there she was again, but now she was staring at the camera, or rather, staring at me. I looked outside the phone again and saw nothing. I looked back at the screen and saw the figure getting closer. I shouted for Mike and Ryan, but there was no response. I ran towards the fence to get out of there as quickly as possible. When I reached Ryan's car, I sent a message to them saying they needed to leave immediately. Minutes later, they arrived at the car. We sat down, and I showed the video to both of them. What we saw in the recording was terrifying. The woman started to slowly lift her head and then began to move towards me, but you couldn't see her legs moving. It was as if she were floating. The video is saved on my old iPhone 4S, which unfortunately doesn't turn on anymore. It just gets stuck on the Apple logo. I still haven't had the courage to reset the phone because I don't want to lose that video at all. My friends believe that the woman was just someone else who happened to be in the cemetery that night, but I never believed in the supernatural until that night. Alice and I have a farm in Buckingham, Iowa, where we primarily grow corn. This happened in August 2018, on a night when it was lightly raining. Our lives have always been dedicated to farming. It's all we know. Living on a farm in rural Iowa means a lot of open space and few people around. Our closest neighbors, George and Kenny, live about 500 meters away in opposite directions and are also farmers. Here, with so little going on, it's natural to form friendships with the neighbors. We often have George, Kenny, and their wives over, and vice versa. On one of those ordinary weekends, we had George and his wife over for drinks. We all ended up a bit drunk while playing board games. They left around 11 o'clock. Since it was only a 30-second walk to their house, there was no concern. Alice and I continued drinking a bit of wine while watching one of our favorite movies. We were starting to feel sleepy, feeling the effects of the alcohol. We were probably going to end up falling asleep on the couch wrapped in each other's arms when we heard knocking on the front door. Having someone over at that hour was very strange. In fact, it had never happened before. Besides the knocking, we thought we heard someone say something. I lowered the volume of the TV and we waited. About 20 seconds later, more knocking, accompanied by a muffled voice asking, "We need help." I was about to get up and open the door when Alice grabbed my arm, looking concerned, shaking her head negatively. I whispered, "I'll just ask who it is." She replied that we shouldn't give any sign that we were home, but it was likely they already knew. I went to the door and asked, "Who is it?" The voice on the other side said, "Thank God. Can you open? We're lost." I asked, "Who is we?" The answer was, "My wife and I." I retorted, "Can your wife say something?" There was a brief silence. I asked again, "Did you hear me?" The same voice replied, "Yes, but she's not here next to me right now." It was at that moment that my alarm bells began to ring. I noticed that the voice sounded forced, as if a man were trying to make it higher. I laughed and asked, "George, is that you?" George loves to joke, and it wouldn't be surprising if he did something like this after drinking. The voice answered, "Yes," now with a slightly deeper tone. For a moment I almost believed it was George, but something still made me suspicious. Someone knocking on the door late at night claiming to be lost was unusual behavior around here and enough reason to be worried. I said through the door, "Prove it. What's your wife's name?" An unfamiliar voice replied, "That's a tricky question." My smile vanished immediately. I went to grab the phone and call George. Alice, who had been watching everything, suggested we call the police. I said, "Wait a minute." The phone rang 3 times before George answered. I asked, "Are you at my door right now?" And he replied, "No, why?" I explained that someone was trying to trick us into opening the door. George said he would come running and hung up. It's worth mentioning that we were all a bit intoxicated in this situation. The knocking on the door continued. I shouted, "I have a shotgun here waiting for you if you don't leave now." The voice on the other side replied, "We just want to use the phone. That's all we need." Alice called 911, but it takes a long time for a police officer to get to us out here. We heard footsteps on the wooden porch around the house. It sounded like there was more than one person. They stopped at one of our windows, and we heard someone trying to lift the blinds. This made Alice, who was still on the phone, scream, "Get out of here!" I followed with my own shout, "Get out of here or I'll shoot." That's when it occurred to me to run and grab the shotgun from the cabinet. Literally seconds later, I heard more knocking on the door, but this time it was really George's voice shouting, "Open the door!" I let George in and he brought his shotgun too. He said he hadn't seen anyone when he arrived. He stayed with us until the police showed up and did a quick check of the property before leaving. Following his advice, we installed security cameras at the front and back of the house, something we incredibly had never thought of before this incident. To this day, it gives me chills to think that the only thing separating whoever was on the porch from us was a simple wooden door. This story happened on my grandparents' farm during the summer of 2018. That night I was alone since they had gone out and paid me to take care of the place for a few days. It was my last night there, and I was watching TV in the living room when I started hearing a strange noise coming from the cornfield. At first, I ignored it, thinking it must be a deer. But soon after, all the cows started mooing at once. Normally, it's rare to hear more than one cow at a time, so when they are all mooing like that, something is definitely wrong. Someone or something had scared them. Since I was the only one around, I knew it was my responsibility to find out what was going on. I grabbed a jacket from the closet and was about to head out when I heard a particularly high-pitched moo coming from the barn. I froze in place, my boots shaking. Something was very wrong. Quickly, I ran up the stairs to my grandfather's room where he always kept some guns. I loaded his hunting rifle and went out to investigate. The cows were still agitated, so I headed straight for the barn to check. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The cows were there, but upon closer inspection, I noticed that one of them was missing. I was sure it had been tied up in the stable earlier. Then, I heard a moo coming from the cornfield outside the barn. I went over there, but as I walked toward the field, I swear I heard voices, as if someone were talking. I had had enough. I fired 2 shots into the air, and everything fell silent. The cows stopped mooing, and the field was completely quiet until I heard footsteps. I didn't know if I had the courage to enter the cornfield, but I knew I had to. After all, farmers don't have guns for nothing, and I couldn't stay inside with intruders in the field. I entered the crops and started hearing footsteps around me. The further I went, the more fear took hold. That's when, among the rows of corn, I spotted a person dressed in black just a few meters away from me. I raised my weapon and said to him, "Get out of my field." I wasn't bluffing, I was ready to shoot. However, he didn't move. I fired another shot to scare him, but he remained still. Then he started walking toward me with his arms slightly extended, as if he were asking me to lower the gun. I shouted again, "Go away!" That's when I realized the worst. I was surrounded by several people, all in dark clothing, at least 6 or 7. Fear paralyzed me. The first man continued to approach, and I noticed that, like the others, he was wearing a scary mask. As I backed away, the group fell silent, which only increased my terror. I thought my time had come. Suddenly, they began to chant something. I couldn't understand the words. It sounded like an unknown language, but the melody resembled a song. It crossed my mind that they were about to perform some kind of macabre ritual on me. I took the opportunity to run as fast as I could between the rows of corn. When I stopped, breathless, I fired 6 more shots in their direction. Finally, I heard hurried footsteps and the sound of plants being crushed as they fled. I ran back to the farmhouse, and on the way I saw something I will never forget. A cow's head in the center of a circle of candles. My stomach churned, and as soon as I got to the house, I vomited. I grabbed the landline phone and called the police, telling them everything that had happened. The operator told me she would send an officer immediately. After hanging up, I called my parents, asking them to come pick me up. My father said he would arrive in an hour. I returned to my grandfather's room and stayed there, trembling and crying, until I heard the police car. I had never felt so relieved to see someone. I explained everything to the officer, who searched the barn and part of the cornfield, finding the cow's head. He called in a search team since it was now a crime scene. When my parents arrived, I spoke with them and the officer about everything that had happened. My grandparents didn't let it go and installed security cameras all around the farm. Who those people were, I don't know, but they were clearly performing some sort of sacrifice ritual. It just happened that I was there, alone on the night they chose for it. My name is Anthony. I'm 25 years old, and I live on my family's farm. From time to time, I help take care of it when my parents travel. It's not a large commercial farm, just a small family property. They want me to take it over when they get older and can't manage everything on their own, since I'm the oldest of 3 children and the only boy. But to be honest, I have no desire to do so. I can't see myself spending the rest of my life in rural Arkansas, especially after something quite strange happened last July. My parents went on a romantic trip and were gone for a week. So, I was in charge of the farm with my 2 sisters, Emma and Grace. The property is pretty isolated, which means a lot of privacy, too much privacy in my opinion. But that night in particular, things changed. It was quite late, and I was starting to get ready for bed. My sisters were taking online classes. Emma was in her room busy with her summer courses on her laptop, while Grace and I were in the living room watching some silly show. The 3 of us somewhat shared the desire to escape this life on the farm. I especially feel it more intensely, being in my 20s and feeling like I still have a lot to explore beyond here. One of the worst parts of living on a farm is dealing with predators. Not just the animals that destroy your crops, but also the people who might show up to steal what's yours. Believe it or not, it really happens. It's not something common for us, but it has occurred before. We have some weapons at home precisely because of that. On one of those nights, our 2 dogs started barking uncontrollably in the yard. Something had clearly frightened them. My first reaction was to go outside and see what was happening. When I got out there, I saw that they were focused toward the fields, completely agitated. I yelled for them to calm down, and they quieted down, but I kept watching and listening. That's when I heard a whistle coming from the middle of the cornfield, and it was definitely a human whistle. It was the first time I faced something like this without my dad around. I ran back inside the house to grab one of the guns. The dogs started barking again. I told my sisters, "There's someone in the cornfield. I need to chase them off." They immediately said it was a terrible idea to run into the cornfield in the dark, and I realized they were right. The idea of confronting this situation in the middle of the night alone was absolutely terrifying. So instead of going after him, I went back to the yard with the dogs, who were still barking wildly toward the fields. I grabbed the gun, aimed it at the sky, and fired a shot which echoed through the night and made the dogs stop immediately. Feeling more confident, I shouted, "Get off our property!" I thought that would solve the problem and went back inside. My sisters were laughing at the situation, which made me laugh too. But the lightness didn't last long, because soon the dogs started barking again, this time even more desperately. I ran outside, ready to do what I had done before, but my heart stopped for a second when I saw a man standing about 6 meters away from the dogs, right in front of the cornfield. He was staring at me. I shouted, "Hey!" And that's when he ran into the cornfield. I started running after him, firing another shot into the air. I stopped near the dogs, but there was no chance I would go into the cornfield in that darkness. I wasn't going to leave the dogs outside either. I unchained the dogs and brought them inside. I told my sisters I saw someone sneaking through the cornfield. The first thing we did was call our dad. He told me, "You need to take on the role of man of the house and protect your sisters. If he comes back, fire another warning shot." After all that, we slowly went to our rooms. My sisters took the dogs to sleep with them, and I brought the gun with me because we were all still a bit shaken by what had happened. I left my bedroom window open, and while I was lying down watching a movie on my laptop, I heard that whistle again coming from outside. I ran to the window and saw someone walking slowly across the grass. As if he had noticed my presence, he stopped and turned to look directly at my window, continuing to whistle. It was clear that he was trying to provoke and scare us. A pretty stupid move, since I had made it clear that I was armed. I grabbed the gun that was on my bed and aimed it out the window. I fired into the grass a few meters from him on purpose. That was enough to interrupt his horror movie act, and he quickly disappeared from sight, heading toward the front of the house. This time, he didn't come back. It would take a lot of stupidity to return after that. I told my sisters what had happened and explained why I had shot. I assured them that the intruder wouldn't return. In the end, we never found out who he was or why he was there. It could have just been some teenager or a group of them wanting to scare farmers for fun, or maybe it was someone truly dangerous. We'll never know.